Good morning, everybody. This is LP Mainville talking, High Performance Director for the OVA. Welcome to this webinar on a beautiful Saturday morning. At least it is here in Hamilton. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on a Saturday, actually, and taking some of your time to come and learn with us. Today we have an interesting topic of physical preparation. It should be very, very interesting. Now, just to make sure, can everybody hear me? If you can, just please give me a yes in the chat box. That will tell me that they can hear me well. Perfect. Seems like the sound is going through. So great. We're gonna get going. A couple of housekeeping rules, I guess. In order to get your PV points, okay, for your certification, I need to know who you are. So right now, I can see your names, the names of most of you if I go into the participant list. But a lot of you are still named viewer 5, viewer 21, and so on. If you want to get your PV points, make sure to change that for your full name. Or just put your name in the chat box so I can get people. Okay. So today, physical preparation with the guys from Mettle Sports Training. You would have seen Rory, Jason, and Steve at some point at provincial championships last year. They've been pretty involved, and they're now our Team Ontario Elite service providers for physical training. They have lots to talk about this morning, so I'm going to pass the presentation to them so they can get going. And yeah, so I hope you enjoy. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. The Mettle guys will be happy to answer them. So without further ado, have a great presentation and a great Saturday.
Just 1 second. Oh. Can everybody hear us?
There we go. Can you hear us okay? Yep. All right. Awesome.
Sweet. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us as well. And we've got myself, Jason McCullagh, Rory, and Steve here to take you through this presentation around physical prep for athletes. So this is our protocol that we cover for preparing athletes for both games and training. So anybody who's working with us today will recognize a lot of this stuff, and those of you who aren't, this might be very new and different from what you expect to see out there or what you generally see out there in the volleyball world. So we will move forward. A lot of people think that we've misspelled the word metal, so just so you understand why we call the company Mettle. Mettle really means, durability, being able to fight through adversity, being able to accept challenges and demanding situations. So it fits really well with what we do in creating kind of injury-proofed athletes in the OVA. As LP said off the start, we are really happy to be official partners with the OVA for long-term athlete development, and this is, one of the things that we're doing is getting together with coaches who are interested to help them understand how to keep athletes safe and healthy throughout the season, as well as build strength and athleticism. And as you probably see in the OVA app, we're launching videos that will be available to anyone that has the OVA app, and they can see this protocol on the app over the course of the next few months.
All right. Just a few people can't hear us, but I just wanted to check in. Okay. So a few people here. So yeah, there is audio, Tori, if you can, there you go. Yeah, this bubble up here.
Let us know once you can hear us, Tori, and we'll continue going. I don't want you to miss anything. Check 1, 2, 3. Gives me a tone. Huh. LP, what are your thoughts? Continue on. Are you going to help them out? You want to help them out on the side? Okay, so we'll keep going. LP will help Tori get up and running here. But a lot of you know the long-term athlete development pathway and know it well. The building athletes from the bottom up is really critically important. As you guys know as well, we generally come in on the training side around the 11, 12-year-olds. So we start at kind of 12U is the lowest age group, at least in the OVA that we train. And what we're finding is already at that age, there's significant movement issues with the athletes. And a lot of times it stems from the fact that we're not getting involved, or there's not enough intervention at the bottom of this pathway, which is, from 0 to 12, basically. So we're seeing non-structured, probably just a little too unstructured programs for athletes out there, or just kids who are developing movement at a young age. And when we get them, it hasn't been supervised well enough to help them get into some of the movement positions that we need them to get into. So a lot of the time we're having to kind of step back into kind of more of a physical literacy training program to get them moving properly. So you see that in a lot of our preparation protocol, that we're reteaching them those kind of fundamental movement patterns. Yeah. Okay. Little lag here in the transition. There we go. So when we're looking at athletes, we take as everybody knows, we do most of our training mobily. So we come to the site of where the team is practicing and training, and we train them right on site with the equipment that we bring. So with that in mind, we don't just do generic programming for the athletes. We take into account these 4 key pieces to make sure that we're providing the appropriate programming for the athlete or team. And we're going to go through them all in more detail, but those things are age, obviously not only their chronological age, but their training age and their PHV, as well as loads. So what time of the season they're in, are they playing high school or public school volleyball at the same time as OVA? Are they involved in a team like the Team Ontario Elite, etc.? We do an assessment on all of our athletes before they come into the program. So those results of those assessments will guide our programming as well. And then injury, of course, if there's a present injury, that's our number 1 priority to get them healthy again. And we want to look at past injuries because that will help us guide programming to avoid that injury, or maybe adjust something that is limited based on that past injury. So we'll get into detail on all 4 of those in the upcoming slides. So we'll start with age, and maybe I'm going to pass it over to Rory to take us through this slide.
Yep. So generally when we work with, as Jason mentioned, the kind of 11 to 12-year-old age groups, as you can see by kind of the general PHV curves that have been developed, when we start our intervention, we're recognizing that a lot of athletes, not at kind of any specific sport really, but just a lot of athletes are underutilizing some of their motor pattern development. So not taking advantage of kind of physical literacy based programs, just I want to say a lack of activity in general. So when they come in, they haven't been coached on good movement patterns. I apologize. Just in a sense that they're very kind of raw, almost raw material when we get them. So we do have several athletes that are we would call them studs. They come in, they've played multiple sports, and that's usually what we encourage them, is try to get as many sports in as you can to give them a more robust movement pattern base. But when we generally get them, we try to take them as close to the skill requirements or the training requirements that we can during this developmental phase. So at the kind of 11, 12, you'll notice that for females, they are actually probably at their peak in that growth development phase. So we have to really monitor when we're doing our training programs are they in that period when they're going to be at a kind of a lax state almost, when their joints are still are in a rapid change? So a lot of the exercises that we would typically prescribe have to be modified just to account for joint laxity or any pain, especially in the knees, ankles. Just saw a question pop up. We'll address that in a second. And then for the boys, they're actually at a point where a lot of them haven't hit that growth spurt, so we can train them pretty well, and their movement patterns haven't shifted too much in that growth phase. So you might see the odd kind of 12-year-old who's spurted up to 6 feet, and he's kind of still figuring out how his body works and how his body mechanics are going to function. And at that point, we really want to address just kind of slow motor patterned control exercises. So a lot of isometrics or eccentrics to get them to kind of really understand where their body is. Whereas some of the kids who haven't hit that spurt, they look like just miniature versions of stud athletes. They move well, they run well, their locomotion patterns are on point. And so you can see as we start to take them through the ages that are kind of 14, 15 for boys, that's when we really start to see a lot of changes. And in some of the videos that we have up that are coming up, we have a couple boys that are kind of in that category where they, I think we cued them about 30 times to try to get them to move in the pattern that we wanted, and they have no idea kind of where their shoulders are, where their hips are, that their back is completely rounded out. So from a coaching standpoint, it gets pretty interesting. So yeah, no. So a key takeaway on that is when we look back at the long-term athlete development pathway, yes, there is physical literacy taking place at the very young ages, but we constantly are teaching physical literacy because the bodies are changing, the levers are moving along the body, the limb lengths are changing, the strength of the athlete is changing, etc. So we have to keep revisiting this along this kind of developmental PHV so that they don't lose that. Viables. It should be variables. I apologize. A little spelling error there. Should be variables in training age for that question, Lisa.
All right.
So the next part is really looking at training load, and there's a ton of research going into the new VERT technology, and I know that was a presentation that was up, and it was a great presentation by Kelly Armstrong, or Carrie. I apologize if it was Kelly. Carrie, I apologize. But it just, the kind of the wear and tear that we're starting to recognize in athletes' joints, just from the sheer volume of jumping and hitting specifically, are the two things that we want to keep into consideration when we start designing programs for athletes, especially overhead athletes. So, as you can see with school, other sports teams, practice commitments, family, all of these kind of stressors in their life, whether they're emotional or physical, start to take a toll on the athlete. So when we get into our initial protocol, the emphasis is a lot on kind of restorative based breathing, on getting them into passive stretching so that they can get their body kind of relaxing into good movement patterns. And just based on sheer repetitiveness of kind of sitting in school all day, texting, and then kind of that dominant forward swing, we do see a lot of kind of anterior shoulder dominance. Glutes are typically turned off. So when we look at our training loads, we want to make sure that we address those movement pattern deficiencies to make sure that we balance the athlete back out. So a lot of the times when we get into work with the athletes, a lot of the perception from both the coaches, but parents, some of the athletes even, is they're going to be getting a hard workout and they should leave kind of sweating and breathing and soreness. But we have to kind of remind them, like, our job is not to make you feel sore. Our job is to make sure that you're prepared for what your competition needs are. So we recognize a lot of athlete development coaches, and I'm putting that in quotations, get the athletes doing kind of jumping-based programs right away or lifting-based programs right away, and haven't really taken the time to address kind of the dysfunctional patterns that they're going into. I know Steve just mentioned something, so I'm going to let him jump in really quick.
Yeah, I'll just give you a quick explanation on this and how, the overall, these youths as well as all of us kind of suffer from muscle imbalances. So Rory touched base and said the glutes are off. The glutes are not off. They're just not as on as much as they should be, okay? So there's areas of dysfunction in the glutes, which is always a scary thing because the glute is the strongest muscle of the body. So to touch base on our overall assessment protocols, we assess ankle, hip, thoracic spine mechanics. Basically, from texting everyday life, you adapt to your everyday life. So we see a lot of postural influences caused by sitting, right? The issue with this is you're going to get overactive muscles, underactive, and then tight muscles. And this flaws the posture. If posture is flawed, it doesn't matter who you are, you will break down in time, whether it's an athlete, whether it's someone that's never played a sport in their lifetime, right? So the biggest component of this is to really create stability and mobility in the joints to reflect a positive base of structure to develop movement skill off of, to increase their flexibility, right? And I'll touch more on this at the end, but I just want that known. If a youth is sitting there texting all the time, sitting at a desk, they will adapt to this in time. It's a repetitiveness. And what will end up happening is the whole body, biomechanically speaking, is flawed. Power, strength, speed, it's not going to be efficient if this isn't dealt with right away. So we assess that, and then this is the basis of when we transition to our prep design, right? So when people think stretching, if you're stretching a certain way, like a static stretch, a lot of people think that's just muscular in nature. It's not. The bottom is systematic. The body is systematic. So at the end of the day, you're also getting joints, you're getting tendons, you're getting all these, the fascial sheaths, you're getting all these things. So it has to be a controlled process. And when we transition to our movement-based stuff, we're teaching the athletes an awareness of how their body moves. And that is the most important thing that we can teach them. So it's basically like taking your car in for a checkup. You're not going to take your car in 2 years for a checkup. You're going to do it on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis. This is the same with an athlete. I have had athletes that I've trained that we've trained, and they've really focused on this prep protocol as well as the strength aspect, and they feel great. And then they dial off this for a bit, and they're like, Coach Steve, like Coach Jason, Coach Rory, my ankle's feeling loose today, my knee's in pain. And we want them to understand in these movements these issues so they can focus on them. And then we have conversation about that. But that's basically what I'm touching on, is we're dealing with those dysfunctional patterns by doing that.
Yeah. The other, key part of that obviously is the movement dysfunction. But when we look specifically at our training loads, that's a huge component of it. Is a lot of the time we're getting athletes either before or coming off of a practice. So getting into kind of heavy load-based jumping or lifting protocols that some coaches will design are putting the athletes even further out of balance. So when we kind of look at a team practice schedule or training schedule, we do take into consideration their workload. So as you can see with the last point there, workload, like the work to rest ratio, we like to get as much of that information as possible. And we're just in the beginning of the training season now. So a lot of this information is still coming in for us. So we're relying a lot on the coaches to give us an understanding of how their practices are looking, how the athletes are looking. At the bottom of the screen here, you can see this is just a quick snip of the wellness email, we put out. So it's a form builder that we created that we can gather this information on a weekly basis. Exactly at in about 20 minutes, all the athletes across our database are going to get this. And this is just a way for us to start to recognize kind of pain indicators, sleep indicators, areas of wellness that we would start to utilize to make sure that we're making sure the athletes are not kind of coming in a state of fatigue, as well as when we get them in, if they're at a high pain rating or a soreness rating, then we're going to look at dialing back some of the training programs just to make sure that they're not overdoing it. So the next one is obviously the injury history, and I don't know if anyone would disagree with this, but I think it's kind of one of the main components to what we would want the athletes to focus on is anytime, and I've rolled both ankles multiple times, low back herniation. I think all of us have our horror stories. I know that's probably why we got into this industry, is try to help these athletes. But what Steve alluded to is educating the athletes is a key component for us to allow them to understand how their body moves or compensates for their movement in a day-to-day basis. So Steve always uses the example of water. Our body is mostly made up of water. So if we take a glass of water, we pour it into a vase or into a shoe, it's going to mold and adapt to the shoe. So
Bruce Lee quote, by the way.
It's a Bruce Lee quote.
I ripped them off, right?
But when we look at the athletes, I'll actually show a picture quickly when we get into the prep protocol. We see them start to adapt to some of the motor patterns that they've developed, as well as the injury patterns that they've either overlooked or haven't fully rehabilitated. So when we get them, in addition to the assessment, what we're trying to do now is, as the month is coming to a bit of an end, and we've been able to kind of wrangle all the data and points together, is start to take these athletes and refer them out to some of our clinicians that can address these issues at a deeper level, on a one-to-one level, so that they can get healthy. And then when they come back into the group environment with us, we're kind of comfortable in putting them back into some of these patterns, just because of the sheer volume that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And I'm sure you can all appreciate having 12 kids running around, and one has an issue, and you can't focus on that issue for the entire practice. So this is one thing that we start to look at. We give recommendations through the app that we can talk about later, in terms of, here are some corrective-based movement patterns you can do. Here are some exercises that we want you to address on a global scale. When we get into working with clinicians, they'll have the ability to program for the athletes as well, so we can see it. So when we get them back into the group environment, we know kind of their return to play protocol. So this is obviously something that, as coaches, you will start to recognize as well, as if your athlete is, for whatever reason, injured, whether it's shoulder, ankle, knee, having them sit out of practice early is just a waste of time for everyone. So in my recommendations and our recommendations is get them doing something. So if it's the prep protocol and they do it at a level that they're able to, at least the rest of their body is going to stay sound in its movement patterns. And then just obviously making sure that they don't stress out the area of injury too much. So any other thoughts on that?
No, yeah, you nailed it 100%. Just saying that, so when an athlete suffers injury, and as you all know, if you've suffered injuries or you see your athlete, they compensate to that dysfunction, right? So if an athlete rolls the ankle, they're going to compensate. So say it's a right ankle, they're going to transition to the left side. If I use the car analogy again, basically it's like a car with a spare tire on it, right? And trying to go 140 down the highway, it's not going to happen. This is just like the athlete's body. They will give into dysfunction, creating injury down the road by these compensating patterns.
Yeah, great. Thoughts on that? The last part, obviously, is our assessment and intake. At various levels, depending on kind of timing as well, is a big variable for us. working with the Team Ontario team, we had about 4 hours that we got to sit down and kind of work with each athlete and talk to them and get to know them and get to know their injury history, and then take them through kind of these performance markers and muscle testing, our functional movement screen, static postural assessment. At other levels, we've had, I think, 4 teams come in 1 hour. So we have to really modify what is important, both to the club, the athlete, and to us from a programming standpoint. So what we try to do in this scenario is we try to take the best case information for us to see the athlete's kind of dysfunction. Again, we commonly use that term, but for instance, with one club, we were only able to do, just based on the sheer timing of it, an overhead squat in our functional movement test, just to see a right to left imbalance in their squat pattern, as well as any thoracic, hip or ankle dysfunction as well. And then I know Steve has gone to almost every single athlete that we've worked with so far and done a muscle test on them, and the process continues. Just because that is a key component of where the athlete will break down, whether it's a single repetition or multiple repetitions. We want to know how strong the athlete is to perform certain patterns. And then when we get into kind of why the prep protocol was designed, is it addresses a lot of the areas of dysfunction that these athletes will commonly be presented with us. So again, we can let Steve kind of jump in on that when we get into the specific exercises, but that's what we'll do right now.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it's a bit of a long lead up, but it's really important to cover, why we did what we did here. You guys are all coming to learn what we think you should do before a game in training, but it's important to understand how we got to it. And as Rory said, we don't have the ability to do this full testing screen on all of our athletes that come in, but we have, about 1,000 athletes in our system right now that we have worked with this season alone. And what we've seen is, as Rory pointed out, some very common aspects across all of the athletes. So this prep protocol basically takes care of the majority of those very common issues in volleyball athletes. So it helps them prepare, it helps them correct, it helps them understand their body better, not only just get ready for the game. So it is corrective in nature. So doing it will make them better athletes, will make them move better, and will correct some of the imbalances that they have if they're doing it properly. So kind of the reasoning behind it. And then as we get into more detailed athlete-specific stuff, they'll receive the details of those exercises in their online system, and they'll be able to do those at home.
Yep. So we've generally broken down into the movement pattern, the preparation protocol into 4 categories. So we begin with an active isometric, which I'm realizing is currently spelled wrong. I was up late trying to clean this up, nice. But I obviously missed a couple. We do a rise and acceleration mechanic to try to get the motor patterns working once we've loosened up or stiffened up certain areas. We go into a passive neural and muscle activation sequence, which includes part of our Mettle stretch, which we'll go through. And then we finish with a neural stimulation. So as we're going through this, I want you to keep in mind, this is an extensive preparation protocol. It covers off, I think, 99% of your body when you get to it, except for your eyeballs, unless you're really working them.
No, it even works better.
But the common question that we receive from the coaches is, or from the athletes is, when do I do this? When's the appropriate time to fit this in? And our ideal scenario is you do this every time, obviously, and we assume that everyone has, 15, 20 minutes before they have to start practice to actually go through the whole process. But in the reality of some tournament play, where you might have 5 minutes before the next match starts, and you don't have really any time to take a break or rest or eat even, we do still want the athletes to go through some of the sequences, including the Mettle stretch, because it addresses a lot of the kind of the key areas, the ankle, the hip, and the thoracic spine, And then the stimulation component is very beneficial, just to make sure that the athlete's nervous system is awake and firing. So I think the common takeaway for this is when we get the athletes to do kind of this sequence, we know that their body's in a state of readiness, because the common element to most injury is fatigue. So having an athlete finish a tournament or finish a game and then jump right into the next match, and their body's fatigued and their nervous system's already starting to tire, that's when the majority of the injuries start to become apparent. So I just wanted to throw that in there, just so you know kind of when and where to use it.
No, it's awesome, and we're going to take you through in the next few slides the actual movements. I think what's really important, and I heard an interesting quote the other day, I can't remember who said it, but it takes about 10 times as much time to correct a poor movement pattern than it does to develop a new one. So a lot of these athletes were kind of we're rebuilding their movement patterns, and we're trying to deconstruct some of the poor movements that they've or positions, I guess, even that they get themselves into. So what's really important with this, and I think Rory touched on it a little bit, is that it's done regularly and consistently. If we get into it, and people on the call here are saying, yep, I buy in, I think it's great, and then you go to the tournament and kind of just let them do what they're comfortable doing and what they've normally done forever, it's probably not going to stick, right? So we need to get in the habit of doing it. We sit at OCs all the entire month of April, and we watch some of the preparation, and no offense to anyone who's doing it, but some of the quote unquote warm-ups aren't getting done what we'd really like to get done. So we hope we can educate some people, and they can take this away and use some pieces of it. There might be some stuff in your, we'll take some questions at the end, of course, but there might be some stuff that you're doing that looks very similar, and that could be good as something that you could sub in. So let's talk about that, and let's just make sure that we understand the very specific cues as well, because these need to be done, or it's ideal if these are done, but it's very important that they're done properly.
So I had to put this disclaimer in because it's come up just in the past of training, is that we are movement guys. Like, we love to make sure the athletes are moving well, just due to the sheer repetitiveness of volleyball specifically, but of any sport. We want to make sure that their mechanics are efficient before we start advancing them into various lifting programs or Olympic lifting. So we do want all of our athletes to develop into Olympic lifting, as it is kind of the best way to get the athlete fully prepared, but we don't want to rush the process. So just in case, I put that at the bottom, just in case anyone thinks we're only about having our athletes stretch, that's not really what we're about. We want to make sure that when we start lifting, that we're confident that the athletes are aware of how their bodies move, how they break down, especially, and then when they would start to fatigue, what they can do to correct or maybe modify the exercise to gain the most out of it. So I'm going to let Steve jump in and take on a majority of the explanation for these ones. As you can see, he's featured in all of them. He's our boy. But I just wanted to quickly point at the top kind of left corner here under the toe mobilization, soleus activation, the picture of the feet. So this is an athlete. I won't drop names, and maybe Steve will, just because we've got a great relationship.
He would like to be mentioned, though, that's for sure.
Yeah. He came into us broken, and I say broken in when we did his muscle test. He scored, I think, very low. I think it's
even the FMS. It was scary,
and the FMS was also
did he even
quite
pass
bad.
the FMS? No, I don't think he even passed it.
And then when we did the static assessment, as you can see, just by kind of his foot position, his right foot is very much rotated, as it's his plant leg, and then you can see just how flat his feet have gotten. So a lot of the first I think we had him for about 6 weeks, 8 weeks.
7 weeks total.
7 weeks, was literally hammering the preparation protocol every day. Every time we saw him, we would advance it a little bit, maybe add an exercise or add a cue, add something that could rebalance this. But we spent a lot of time working on his feet, spent a lot of time working on his hips, and obviously his thoracic spine.
Just the body as a whole in general.
The issue that we came up with, and it's kind of part of our recommendation as well, is we want the athletes to dial down the repetitiveness of sport. So taking a bit of an off season, this athlete continued to play at a high level, and anytime we got him back in after a tournament weekend, we would basically have to start from scratch again, because his body would just get right back into those poor mechanics. And as soon as we started him on the prep protocol, it was very apparent that he had not really done what he was supposed to do from a preparation standpoint, but also his body was just so adapted to those patterns that we had to break him down again. So it'd take 2 days, 3 days for him to break back down before we could take him to another progression in the exercise. And it was kind of like that for a majority of the summer, until we could actually start getting him into some proper lifting techniques. So anyway, I'll pass it over to Steve to talk about.
I'll just take one quick shot on that too. I know we're getting late into the call, but Rory alluded to it quickly, but I think it's important to mention, this was one of our best volleyball players in the country at his age. So this is someone who you see him on the court, and nobody without a kind of trained eye would say that there's something wrong with him. They'd say, geez, this guy is absolutely incredible. He's an amazing athlete. He's perfect. He's in great shape. He's not injured. And he wasn't outright injured yet, but there was something coming very imminently if there wasn't some intervention here. So this is going to, change the length of his career in a big, big way. So to the positive side. So I just wanted to mention that. So I'll hand it over to Steve.
Should I still touch base on that a little bit, or is that, just quickly, his right side there, he completely overused it. And this created, like I initially explained before on overactive, tight and underactive muscles, just to explain the muscle system and keep it simple, is he was really overusing the overactive muscles. And when a muscle is highly overactive, eventually it will tighten and it will compress, and it will restrict in blood flow. Now your strongest muscle becomes your weakest muscle, and when you fatigue, you give into that because neurologically you've adapted to that muscle being strong. So you see this a lot with female athletes going into knee valgus. That's predominantly from a wide pelvis, biomechanically speaking. But what he would do is he would really drop his knee in, giving into his adductor, so his vastus medialis, relying on that. And he was, if that happens and he fatigues in the game, he's tired, his knee will just go. All right, so it keeps it simple. A lot to it though. So transitioning to the toe oscillations here, this is known as joint pumping. I was taught this from a man named Paul Gagne. He's a really cool dude. Should I explain the story, or do we have time?
No, we don't have time.
Okay, we don't have time. It's a cool story though. If I ever get to meet any of you, I'll explain it. It's quite cool. But what this is basically, keep it simple, the feet dumb down by being in the shoes all the time, and the feet are extremely adaptive in nature. The toes should function just like the fingers. So what this does right here is, one, plantar fascia, the bottom of the foot, a lot of those tissues will become offset and imbalanced from being in shoes. And the toes, once again, will mold to the shoe. So the feet basically become the shoe. So what we're doing here is optimizing balance of the foot and toe strength. Now we're going to transition. Do you want to control that for me?
Yep. Well, we don't want to talk about the elbow planks.
Yeah, I just like to be a little bit lower.
I can't.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so transitioning to our active isometrics. Once again, one of our biggest things is a loss of stability. So keeping this simple, you got to build a house on a solid foundation. Well, this is the same as the human body. If you have one flaw in stability or mobility, there should be a balance in the joints. It will affect the whole system. So if we're talking the shoulder, I see a lot of shoulder injuries, and what it's actually caused by is lack of function in thoracic spine and hip most of the time. I've easily assessed over 2,000 athletes, and I've seen this all the time. So the thoracic spine goes up to 9 degrees of rotation. If it's off by a degree, that stress that, especially in volleyball, that stress that extra degree should be taking is compensated to other areas of the body.
So when we talk about the kind of active joint pumping and then getting into the active isometrics with the plank, side plank, you can see the two variations at the bottom. The first variation is where we start most of our athletes. And the biggest cue with this one, in addition to kind of the 4 common cues, and I'll just quickly address those, is to really reestablish good hip and shoulder position. So the 4 cues, and you'll see them in the videos if you go to the OVA Champs app and download it, the video series. We talk about kind of postural, so head back, chin in, so tucking the chin in towards your chest, as well as lifting the head up, pulling the shoulder blades back into retraction and a slight depression. We battle with that one simply because a lot of volleyball athletes we've recognized start to have depressed scapula. So we just generally say go into a retraction position. So pinch the shoulder blades, cough to tighten the core. So engaging kind of the rectus, the entire muscle system in the abdomen, and then squeeze the glutes. When we get into the side plank position, that one is obviously it's a big cue in all of them, but this one especially in the middle right here, a lot of the athletes will sit into hip flexion. So the front of the hip will actually start to dip back, and they'll start to rotate through this position. So what you want to cue with the athletes is drive the hips forward, make sure your hips are stacked one over top of each other, and then really maintain a nice true line from the shoulder all the way down through the hip here. And that's going to establish a good mechanical position for the hip, and they should be utilizing in that position their glute medius to maintain that posture. So a lot of the times they won't feel that. They might feel it in their lumbar spine. They might feel it in their obliques. We want to get the glute active. So
yeah, just to add to that, keeping the spinal mechanics like Rory touched base on, tucking the chin, squeezing the shoulder blades, squeezing the glutes. Once again, this is dialing down outside repetitiveness of that text neck or with upper kyphosis, that jazz. You got to make sure every 10 seconds, because they're going to give into that repetitive mold that they've achieved outside of there. They're going to want a text. They're going to compensate to that pattern again, right? Because they're so used to it. Static adaptations become neural adaptations, right? So the body will trick the mind. So every 10 seconds, tell them again to repeat that effort. Tuck the chin, squeeze the shoulder blades, cough to get the core, and squeeze the glutes every 10 seconds.
Nice. So this, we get them into then a rise and acceleration mechanics. So these are 3 that we start with, just because we do recognize some of the dysfunction and especially the hip pattern. So Super Mario's, Frankenstein walks, toy soldiers, very dynamic in nature, as you can see.
Controlled.
But controlled, exactly, yeah. As you can see in all of them, and I think it's quite apparent, is trying to pull that head back into a nice neutral position, keep the hips actively, as basically getting them through almost a full range of motion.
With the adequate range of motion.
An adequate range of motion.
The dynamic range of motion, so that you don't want to go beyond what the hip, the capsules are capable of.
Yeah.
So they have to work within their range of motion, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, just from a perspective of someone who's worked with a lot of youth athletes as well, is it is fun for the athletes to jump into this and start doing it. Generally, the first time that we go through it, I know with my groups anyway, I'm a little bit more lax with it, is I let them have a bit of fun. So it's a great way to get them kind of going through, and just from kind of personal experience, these are actually exercises that we would do in our Tai Chi class as a way to kind of get the hips mobile. So it's very common patterns that we try to incorporate from multiple methodologies of teaching. So
we definitely, again, being kind of a volleyball athlete for many years and coach, and I see the toy soldiers a lot. It's something that's fairly common in traditional warm-ups out in the volleyball court. So we've seen people do it. Really, again, as I said, important to focus on that technique. So we're not reaching towards the toes, bringing the toes to the hands. If it doesn't touch the hand in the normal range of motion, then that's totally fine, right? Steve's got great mobility there and maintains good form. So we don't want to sacrifice form just to get that toe up to the hand.
Yeah, so you can tell, just add postural mechanics, make sure they're there, right? And of course, this is going to improve performance in sprints, jumping tasks, agility, and it's going to increase dynamic range of motion and will reduce injury rate once again.
So then we shift into our passive stretch series, as well as neuroflossing and muscle activation. So these are actually the two boys that I mentioned earlier. So they when we had them cued in, it was interesting to work. I wasn't there. It's funny to watch them though, because I know I've worked with both boys in the past. Is trying to get them to actually understand where their body is moving. So you can see in the cat camel exercise, trying to get a good kind of length through the spine, essentially floss the nerve through. So any nerve conducting through the spinal column, we want that to be kind of move through a nice, I would say, relaxed state as they do it. And then you can, when you look over to the extension, rotation, knee rub, is really getting into that quality thoracic spine rotation that a lot of the athletes are lacking. So in talking to a few coaches, it's, how can we get the athletes to rotate and try to get kind of more rotation in their upper body as they get, as they approach hitting the ball? Because a lot of it is, as we've talked about multiple times already, is that repetitiveness of a forward posture. They end up just using their arm to hit the ball without any real use of the rotational ability. So this is a great drill to get them out of that position and break down that repetitiveness. We then shift into, again, a passive stretch series. So this is our hip series. The inline lunge is fantastic. It's a great way to open up the hip flexors. And typically when we see it, we have to address kind of the dominant hip flexor pattern. So you can see in this athlete right here, she starts off with a little bit of a tightness through the front of the hip. When we get them to do this exercise, we try to get them to correct that pelvic position just by pulling the hips underneath, almost tucking their butt underneath, just to make sure that the hip is balanced before they go into that passive wave that you can see at the bottom. A lot of the times I've recognized, and I know these guys have recognized, the athletes who cannot move predominantly through the hip and the pelvis will actually shift into excessive extension in their lumbar spine and start to move basically through here as opposed to stretching through the hip. So we want to just make sure that when you're doing that, and it'll show up in the videos, that you make sure the athlete's cueing a bit of a glute contraction, as we've talked about, always kind of active through the core, so that we can really isolate mobilizing the front of the hip. In the lateral hip adductor stretch, we want them to set up, as you can see, it's a slight offset. So we say set your foot up at about 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock, depending on which side you're in. And then you want to be shifting the hips in a lateral plane. So you want to be moving to roughly 3 or 9 o'clock in that scenario. And then the hand comes right over. Again, Steve's the best at point this out in the video, actually, and this athlete's the one that does it right at the beginning, is she moves into an anterior flexion position. So she actually flexes forward slightly. So you want to make sure, that the athlete's moving very lateral, staying in that sagittal plane as they move right to left.
Yes, exactly.
And you'll notice that if you cue them to stay straight up, this positional awareness with athletes that's lacking right now, you'll say, hey, you're leaning forward. They don't even recognize that. They're so used to being in that forward posture that they think they're actually leaning back when they're straight up. So make sure you cue that straight up and over, get that lateral stretch in there.
Yeah, and just the understanding of the biggest component of this is never meant to be aggressive. This is a very controlled environment based stretch. So very calming, very similar to like a yoga, but it's the passive based stuff is basically retraining the joint to move properly with the muscles. So it's good stuff overall.
Yeah. And then we finish off with our internal hip stretch, which, as you can see, the foot is placed at about I want to say in between a 2 and a 3 o'clock position, right to left. The back leg right here, you want to have that foot straight back, and then you can actually manipulate the position of all of these. Actually, I should address that. You can manipulate the position of both feet to try to hit various positions of the adductor and the groin. But you'll notice that Steve stacks his hips here, nice tall posture, chin's tucked in, pinch the shoulder blades, the same cues as always, and then he's going to be sitting into the hip stretch here. Again, we've all worked with the athletes that dominant hip flexor, tight adductors. As soon as they sit, their knee will drop in, and their hips will actually sit back into a sitting position, which they're commonly used to. So you just want to make sure that they're staying in a nice tall spine position, hips are pulled through, and they stay kind of moving in, again, that sagittal plane of motion.
Yep.
So the next sequence is a bit of our muscle activation, and these are phenomenal exercises for building, again, awareness of position, as well as good stability in the core. So the corrective bear walks, we see them a lot through with other trainers. We see a lot on Instagram, people doing bear walks. The common cues for this one is making sure the athletes keep their hips stacked over their knees. And a lot of the times we see the hips are too high and the knees are actually back. So we're not really recruiting the musculature that we want. And then the shoulders are stacked directly over the wrist. He's just about to put his hand down in this picture, but you can see that the hand is moving maybe 2 to 3 inches forward. So you want to keep it very small, controlled movements, and then keeping obviously glute contracted, core tight, chin tucked, pinch shoulders. So those cues are always going to be coming up. When we get into the corrective inchworm sequences, there's a couple of variations, and I encourage you again to check out the videos on the OVA Champs app. With the corrective inchworm position 1 here, we try to get the athletes to go from hip, shoulder, and wrist should be in a straight line. So you can see in this image, Steve's got his hand right on her back, trying to push her into that natural shoulder position, because kind of, as you can see in this image, as she starts to move into a walking pattern, she actually drops her hips slightly, her shoulders shift forward, and her wrists are now angled downward. So she's losing a lot of the stretch and activation through her posterior chain, which is what we're trying to activate. So in this position, tuck the head down, biceps should be covering up the ears. This one's an alternating heel to the floor without offsetting the pelvis. So we're not trying to shift the hips in this position. We're trying to literally just push the heel to the floor and get some activation and stretch to the posterior chain, while also pushing your hands to the floor and pinching your shoulder blades to maintain that activation. As you can see way over in the corner here, that's that same athlete. I think we had to stop him about 10, 20 times. No offense to him. He's a phenomenal athlete.
How much better has he gotten?
And he's gotten so much better.
So much better.
But he could not stay out of a push-up based position where his hands were literally directly under his shoulders and his butt was basically just kind of sticking up in the air in a massive lumbar curve. So again, making sure that we don't progress them before they're ready is a huge part. And then as you can see at the top, it could be a forward motion. We usually start with forward, and then once the athletes are capable, we transition them into a backward walking position. Next is kind of more of our muscle activation, as well as our getting into some of our ramping sequences. So we start to get the athletes moving a little bit more dynamically. In the dynamic lunge sequence, you can see it's tough to see in this position, but the heel and the toe are actually stacked. So the back toe is lined up with the front heel. Knee is on track with the toe in this position. I hope you guys can see my mouse because I'm using it a lot here. And this leg is locked out. Again, a lot of the athletes will actually sit into this and drop their shoulders towards the lead leg, and most often will actually bend the back knee. So you want to just cue keeping that back leg locked, and then Steve's kind of talking in my ear at the same time, keeping the toes perfectly straight. and making sure the foot is planted on the floor. Anytime they have any dominance in the adductor or the quad or the hip, the toe will actually start to rotate outward. So you just want to cue that position.
Yeah, so just to give you a quick explanation on that, the reason why you want to break this movement down in that position, you want to differ from volleyball. So my favorite thing to explain, even with this whole process, is what this will create is areas of tissue that are underactive or not active at all. You're going to get them active, and then they're going to support your whole system when you're playing. So we call this a flexibility reserve. So if you move a certain way in volleyball, the tissues that are usually underactive will be there to support the active tissues correlating to your movement in volleyball.
The last one is a dynamic hip swing. So as you can see in the start position, they start with their feet stacked at shoulder width, hands on the hips, and then they're actually dynamically jumping into a squat pattern. So again, this is for us. Every practice we go to, we're assessing the athletes kind of time and time again.
Yeah.
So being able to, as you can see on the end here, getting the knees stacked over the toes are angled outward at about 45 degrees roughly. Nice drop hip position. And then when we look down the line, you can start to see the breakdown in mechanical efficiency with the athletes. So we're going to slow them down in this process and make sure that they get the position. When we get into our quote unquote lifting sequences, we'll actually get them into isometric and active isometric sequences to get them to realize this pattern, so that when we get back to the preparation protocol, they can start to address it, and it actually becomes more of an awareness for them. So you can see each athlete here, and there's only 4 of them. So typically we have 12, sometimes 24, sometimes 36. Trying to address all of these things with each of the athletes becomes a challenge. So we really heavily rely on the athletes being kind of cognizant, aware of their patterns as we do it, to make sure that they can kind of efficiently do it time and time again. The Mettle stretch, I'll leave it there and I'll just quickly address it. It's probably best that you go to the OVA Champs app and watch the full sequence in motion with all the cues. But this hits, like I said at the beginning, most of the entire body, especially you can see ankle is actively motioning through a full range of motion all the way through. We've got the hips engaged, hip flexors we're trying to stretch and turn off. Glutes we're trying to turn on in all these positions, so squeeze the glute. And then you can see the T-spines being worked in all these positions from top to bottom. So this is really a total stretch. The last sequence is actually called the world's greatest stretch. So we've enhanced it by adding other movement patterns before and sometimes afterwards to make sure that we elicit a more beneficial result for the athlete. So I'll encourage you to go check that one out on the OVA Champs app.
We're going to continue through the slides, but we know we have 3 minutes left in the. We don't want to keep you guys too long on your Saturday morning. So if there are questions, I'm going to monitor the questions here while we're going through the last few slides. So if you want to just type them in, we can make sure we address them before we get off. And anything we do miss, we can certainly follow up with you guys via email as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And then finally, the neural ramp sequence, neural stimulation. We vary this actually depending on kind of where the athletes are in their program. So we'll change up kind of the dynamics of each exercise just a little bit to, again, advance the movement pattern. So this one's the beginner level. So we start with a Spider-Man lunge. As you can see here, hands are stacked underneath the shoulders. Back leg is on line with the front hand. And then this front lead foot is straight. So this is one kind of good exercise to view where the athletes are really restricted, and a lot of them, not making it difficult on the boys, but a lot of boys find this position very challenging for the first time, especially in that kind of 14 to 16 age group where their bodies have just really adapted to I'd say poor movement patterns. But you can have a lot of them try this exercise, and you can see where they start to get tight. Make sure the knee's on track with the toe, and then pushing into that hip. We do this as a dynamic, so it is very explosive in nature. Actually, all of them are. So when you get into this position, it's a dynamic jump to the other side. I've used the analogy of a piston pumping. So you actually want to drive the foot back, but apparently not a lot of people know what a piston looks like. So,
we can't always use the car analogy.
We can't always use the car analogies with kids. So essentially just getting that foot to drive straight back in a sprinting position, drive the other leg up, and try to keep a neutral spine as you go.
Once again, explosive but controlled.
What's that? 10:30? Okay. So the next one, the jumping jack, as you can see, we got a mid kind of angle picture of this one. You can see that the toes are perfectly straight. And knees are on track with the toes. The toes are actually pulled up in this position. So we don't want to load into a toe dominant position here. And then when they get the hands up, which you can't really see in this image, but again, you'll see it in the live video, is the hands come directly over top of the head. Biceps are on track or slightly behind the ears because we want to get into a full lengthened position through the lats and through the shoulder, and then they return. Again, explosive in nature. We want them to do each repetition like it's their only repetition, and then when we transition into our vertical jump, as many of you know, the kids are jumping a lot. So a lot of our emphasis with athletes right from the beginning is emphasizing that good squat pattern position. So hands on track with the hips, knees on track with the toes, nice tall posture, chin tucked in, and we encourage a soft landing, again, neutral foot position, and they actually drive their hands as fast on the up phase as they do on the down phase. So we want them to make sure that they're sticking and landing that position and nice and firm. So if we walk around and try to push the athletes over, they're actually landing in a state of readiness. And then we can advance this from, in this picture, it's a non-counter movement. So they actually start in a squat position and go into an explosive jump, transition into a counter movement, sometimes a reactive. So each time the athletes are getting a little bit more compliance with their body, as well as they're getting a little bit closer to sport specificity, and I'm using that in quotations. You can see at the top there, we usually do try to get 2 sets of these in, if not 3, with a rest of about a minute to a minute 30 in between, because we want to really get the nervous system ready and prepared for a game or a practice.
Yeah, so to give you the quick and dirty on that, 1, make sure you're always breathing when you're doing this. Make it quick. The muscle cell recovers within 30 seconds. The neural cell takes 3 to 7 times longer to rest than the muscle cell. So we want efficiency of these jumps when they're playing in volleyball and, of course, movement. And that won't be achieved if, once again, they give into fatigue because they're overdoing it.
I know we're right on time, and so I'll leave this slide up if you want to take a look at it. Happy to share this presentation across with anyone that wants it. So you can email us. Jason already put a message in. Never mind. So if you guys want this deck, please get in touch with us. If you have any further questions, we'd be happy to jump in and support any questions that you have. And I think that's it for us. I will do a quick plug of our recovery kits. We do encourage the athletes to make sure that they have good tissue compliancy, so foam rolling, doing lacrosse ball work, and then doing anything strengthening to reestablish good patterns is obviously going to make our jobs a lot easier and your jobs as athletes a lot easier, or as coaches, sorry, a lot easier, because the athletes will be kind of ready for play. So thank you so much, everyone, for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Just to add, once again, all this is going to create a more durable athlete, and that's what we want. This is why we got together with the OVA. This is why myself, Jason, and Rory got together. Overall, we want these kids to be able to play sport as long as they want, and I think that's the most important thing out of all this.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. Admin at mettlesportstraining.com directly with any questions that you have after the call. And as LP said, he'll get the presentation out to everybody on Monday. Somebody's dog just walked in. Poor little kid.
Have a good day. Take care, guys.